My name is Christina Polechka, and I will be evaluating the first inaugural speech of our 32nd president, Franklin D. Roosevelt, and I will be discussing what kind of nation we were at the time and how his speech would affect an entire generation. Franklin D. Roosevelt gave his speech on March 4th, 1933. During this time, our nation was falling apart and in the middle of the Great Depression. The stock market had crashed, the banks had failed, and families lost their entire life savings. Business grew frightened and laid off more than half of their workers. At this time, 13 million Americans were unemployed. With being elected, Franklin D. Roosevelt had the tough task of figuring out how to get the country back on track and people back to work. He knew that the citizens were looking to him for answers and leadership, and to figure out a plan to get our nation back on track. When giving his speech, Franklin D. Roosevelt used many words of meaning and words that the audience could relate to. He did this by talking about the current state of the nation and how it was strong and will rebound from this. He wanted the citizens to feel that it was not their fault and that it was the government's task to get the nation back on track. With this, he would go on to say, "Yet our distress comes from no failure of substance." He also used rhythm and alliteration. According to Stephen E. Lucas in The Art of Public Speaking, alliteration is the repetition of the initial consonant sound of close or adjoining words. He also tells us that rhythm is the pattern of sound in speech created by choice and arrangement of words. One of the most notable lines from Franklin D. Roosevelt's speech is, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." Franklin D. Roosevelt stirred a lot of emotions in everyone who was watching or listening to his speech. With his speech, he had brought back the thoughts of hope, empathy, and faith. The people knew he was really sincere about restoring the country back to its former glory. He wanted the citizens to have faith once again in the government and the banking system. The speaker's audience was filled with your average citizens, from blue collar to white collar. Every one of those citizens had been affected in some way by what had happened to the stock market and the banks. The audience was filled with those looking for a leader to lead them back to work and not worrying about where the next meal would come from for them. To me, this was a very empowering speech and brought up many emotions of hope and faith, especially with the way our government is now today. To me, it's hard to believe that we don't have such powerful and inspiring politicians in Washington today as like Franklin D. Roosevelt. I believe if we had more politicians like him, our nation would be more glorious and successful, and we would have more people back to work ourselves, and our country would be back on track to where it once was.